Okay, MOvember 19, and for tonight's video, what I want to look at is, am I an addict or not? It's not uncommon that people end up in doctors' offices, psychiatrists, counsellors' offices like mine, and they're not sure. And they've got an issue. They know they're using something, and they're not insane. They know that there's a use, abuse, or addiction issue. Now, if there's also an addiction issue, if you've got a sex and love and relationship addiction, and we've betrayed and misled someone else, there's also an integrity harm disorder to own. So somewhere along this continuum, someone has used either a mood-altering behavior or a mood-altering chemical as a distress reduction tool. So what I want to go through now is just what are some of the things we can do to try and identify that and help us to understand where do I sit on that continuum between use, abuse, and addiction. So a definition for addiction, and if I just bring this one up a little bit so we can see it, addiction is a primary and chronic disease of a brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. There's a dysfunction in these circuits that leads to a characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. And this is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and/or relief by substance use and other behaviors. So when we're looking at something like this, it's this continuing to return to something that becomes, over time. So it becomes chronic over time. So the next thing that we're looking at here in regards to that being a definition is that there is certain criteria for addiction that we need to be clear on. So if I'm working with someone and they're saying, well, look, am I just using this? Then there'll be an absence of these. Somewhere between abuse and dependency, you will see these feature more strongly. So the first one there that you can see, and I'll just bring it up a little larger, compulsive use. So if alcohol, drugs, or sex is available, the addict uses too much of it and uses it often. The compulsive use is just we get this felt sense that we want more, and it's hard to predict when we're going to stop. The next thing is impaired control. When an addict tries to use, control is lost, and usually a single use is followed by many more. As is often heard in Narcotics Anonymous, one's too many, a thousand's never enough. AA talks about the first drink gets us drunk. It's this idea that when we start something, it's unpredictable when we're going to stop. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't stop. Every addict's got a stop story. But what we will see is that it's hard to predict when someone's going to stop. Continued use in spite of consequences. Addicts keep using alcohol, drugs, sex, whatever it is, even when it causes health, relationship, jobs, or legal problems. So those three things, compulsive use, impaired control, and continued use in spite of consequence, start to feature more strongly on that continuum between use, abuse, and dependency. The next criteria that we're looking for is craving. Now, craving's an interesting one because it's nearly a phenomenon, but it's one of those things we can track in the brain's reward and memory and motivational circuitry like we talked about. So craving, the desire for alcohol, gambling, sex, or a drug can change in intensity from minute to minute, and it can even disappear during abstinent periods. And this is one of those things that is really important to understand. I've had people come in and they say, well, I don't think I am addicted. I've stopped now for like a month and I haven't felt like it at all. But what we know is it can return in intensity if we're triggered. So by using a tiny amount might wake it up. That's where people might have a champagne at a wedding thinking, well, I think I'm doing fine. I should be able to toast the bride and groom. And all of a sudden that tiny amount wakes up the cravings and triggers continued use. Or people, places, and things associated with use in the past can wake up cravings. Now, just to give an example, I've been sober 35 years from drugs and alcohol, but when our church moved, street level community folks, I'd had to take a different route, and it took me past a pub that I would have been in a blackout drunk when I was probably 18 years old, and back in the day where you were drinking in pubs from about 15. And I remember the last call I made to someone to come and pick me up because I knew that I was fading fast, and meat tray under my arm, blind drunk. I can still remember the phone booth. It's a very old pub. I imagine it's still there. I don't know if there's a phone in it though anymore. But it really, when I drove past there, I could taste the beer. It really made me feel like a drink. Now, I didn't get the full compulsion. It's been 35 years, but I remembered the drunk. that place just triggered that euphoric memory of what the escape I used to get from alcohol. And I'm a card-carrying alcoholic, there's no doubt about that, because I get this phenomenon of craving. And the next feature is denial. Now, denial is an interesting concept with addiction. There is a saying that addiction is the only disease that tells you that you do not have it. The degree that an addict can minimize use and its consequences is one of the most striking and common manifestations of addiction, as well as the most baffling to others. Breaking through denial is an important component in addiction treatment. And this is where when people come in, when you're trying to break through this denial, I'm usually asking who's in that sort of choir of the baffled, who is worried about you, concerned. When we think they're overreacting, there's nothing to see here. But that's that feature of denial. That's a Patrick Carnes quote. All of this is from Patrick Carnes' Facing Addiction, and it is highlighting that we minimize use and consequence, but there'll be others around us that are completely baffled. Now, this next slide, I'm probably not going to talk through in detail, but it's always the next question of am I an addict is usually, well, why am I an addict? Where did this come from? So in this, and I'll probably do a whole YouTube video on this one, but this is a piece from Carnes' Facing Addiction book. And so as you can see there, he just says, look, this model can be a flow chart with factors that compound addiction potential, or any one problem area could be a catalyst for manifestation of addiction behaviors. And so largely we're looking at really early, genetics, that there could be fewer dopamine receptors because we've got this generational addictive issue in a family system, other family members with addictions, learning and modeling, growing up in a family with adults that have excessive behavior. Modeling confirms this is how to do life and handle feelings. So we just see people medicate their feelings instead of deal with them. Attachment issues, failure to bond with parents or primary caregivers during the first 2 years of life, inability to establish attachment, and we see a lot of the attachment material making its way into trauma treatment now. Childhood trauma stresses, living in fear or chaos leaves children living in crisis mode. Sexual, physical or emotional abuse or neglect or early losses or catastrophes we need to look for. Exposure, teen drinking, teen smoking, teen drug use, teen internet gambling, sexual, physical, emotional abuse or neglect, and the culture that somebody gets immersed in early on. And then adult traumas, war, natural disasters, divorce, loss or partner, a loss of job, a victim of violent crime, loss of a child, chronic or illnesses or disabilities. So for a guy that said he wasn't going to go through it, I just did. And so this idea of a making of an addict is once someone is answering that question for themselves, am I an addict? And we go through that use, abuse, and dependency criteria, and we drop down into it. We look at, well, let's look and see is there a history of addiction? Is there a history of childhood trauma, early teen exposure, attachment issues? And we go deeper there in once we can help someone establish, which parts of that they relate to. The first task that we've got to get through is that feature of denial. And we know that in Patrick Carnes' 30-task model, his very first task is breaking delusion. What is real? And this is where we hear that saying that mental health is a commitment to I'm forgetting Scott Peck's quote now. It's committing to health at all costs, I believe. I'll come back with that one because I know it's M. Scott Peck's saying, and they have it in all of the Meadows and Carnes' literature. So I will come back to that because I'm having a mental block on it. But addiction is, and these are the things that Carnes lists, it's an illness of escape. Its goal is to obliterate, medicate, and ignore reality. It's an alternative to feeling hurt, betrayal, worry. And in his book, he says, and most painful of all, loneliness. So essentially, when what we're trying to medicate is this inability to regulate our own state. Addiction cripples the ability to know what is real, and Carnes says that's our most essential skill. Going through life not knowing what is real can't be underestimated. It's the most essential skill for any person. But an addict, we distort reality so much we don't know it anymore. And then largely we start to weave this string of rationalizations and delusions that sort of cover it all up. So we lose the ability to know what's real, and we surround it with all of this weaving of mayhem and chaos, ridiculousness. And it makes all of the above, makes it impossible to cope with everyday life, jobs and families. We just don't do well. So in early recovery, we are desperately trying to break through this. And Carnes in that first chapter has 4 lists that we go through. One is that we write out all of our problems, every problem we've got. The other one was we write out our secrets. Even if we can't share them at the time, we still write them out. Then we write out all of the excuses and rationales that goes with that secrets. And then we go through a long list of potential consequences. And that starts to break through this delusion and get us to what's real. And then he goes through and he looks at all the denial types. I might do a video on denial types just to help addicts break through and finally see the truth of what's going on. So where we're heading, if addiction is about a disease of isolation, then we're heading to not just connection, but regulation. The buzzword is addiction is about isolation and recovery is about connection. But essentially it's a connection to self. We've got to create safety and be present. We need to start to, treat addiction by treating the underlying traumas. Mindfulness, meditation. As a Christian bloke, this is where we put prayer and moving, and I talk about it in a second, where we move from this disassociation to association, from self-centeredness to spirituality. Carnes makes the point that the organ that's been affected is our brain, and the embodied brain, our central nervous system. So exercise, nutrition and sleep are essential in just giving our brain the best chance to repair. Learning how to get grounded, and I've done a video on Pete Walker's 13 tips of how to deal with emotional flashbacks. That's got a lot of great grounding techniques in. Shrinking your inner and outer critic. Pete talks about his most essential tool that he says he's used the most in his recovery from childhood trauma is the ability to thought block and thought substitute. So if you look back in this YouTube channel, you'll see Shrinking the Inner and Outer Critic. I might revisit them for this year round. And the other one is getting into somatic-based relaxation, massage, yoga, trauma release exercises, stretching, getting in and releasing the tension in the body. So the idea here, as I said, is addiction's about this disassociating, pulling ourselves away from having to inability to regulate, to associating, connecting to ourselves and others. And in Narcotics Anonymous, they talk about the spiritual part of our disease is this total self-centeredness. So the idea here is we're moving from a self-centeredness to a spiritual center. And even for atheists and agnostics in 12-step fellowship and life, we move into a community and culture that accepts us and delights in us and claps when we speak and never, really rejects us away largely. The spirit of the fellowship is about acceptance. But if we can open ourselves up and really confront this disassociation that's happened and the resulting self-centeredness, then, as it says in the 12th step, having had a spiritual awakening, and we move back and we live from that spiritual center. So I hope this video has been helpful. It's usually a very big question for folks is, am I an addict? And to make sense of that use, abuse, and dependency, addiction sort of criteria and that continuum. And I hope some of that information is helpful. You will find that in Patrick Carnes, Facing Addiction or Facing the Shadow. And be gentle with your heart, and I look forward to seeing you in tomorrow's video.